Hey there, friends. I doing this special recording of the message that I preached earlier this morning at our church that just didn't get recorded. We had some kind of technical difficulty, but I just wanted to share the gist, at least, of the message I gave today on the commandment number 6. Commandment number 6 is "Thou shalt not murder," or "You shall not murder," from Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. But the passage I shared today was from 1 John chapter 3, beginning with verse 1. And it says there, "See what kind of love the Father has given to us, that we should be called the children of God. And so we are. The reason why the world does not know us is that it did not know Him. Beloved, we are God's children now, and what we will be has not yet appeared, but we know that when He appears, we shall be like Him, because we shall see Him as He is. And everyone who has this hope in Him purifies himself even as He, Jesus, is pure. Everyone who makes practice of sinning also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. You know that He appeared in order to take away sins, and in Him there is no sin. No one who abides in Him keeps on sinning. No one who keeps on sinning has either seen Him or known Him. Little children, let no one deceive you. Whoever practices righteousness is righteous, as He is righteous. And whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. The reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. And no one born of God makes a practice of sinning. For God's seed abides in him, and he cannot keep on sinning because he has been born of God." You think John's trying to make a point? "By this it is evident who are the children of God, and who are the children of the devil. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is the one who does not love his brother. For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. We should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his own deeds were evil, and his brother's righteous. Do not be surprised, brothers, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death into life because we love the brothers. Whoever does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer. And you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. By this we know love, that He laid down His life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. If anyone who has this world's goods and sees his brother and his sister in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? Let us not love in word or talk, but in deed and in truth." The Word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. I just shared this morning that murder is a lot closer to home than we sometimes might imagine. It's not something that's far, far off somewhere, way, way away from us. One of the earliest memories I have of my life, in my childhood, is a phone call my mother received. I can see the picture in my mind right now, standing in the kitchen as she answers the phone that was hanging there on the wall. And the look on her face of horror and just sadness at the news that one of her brothers had been murdered. He was murdered by a close friend even, in a drunken stupor, who didn't even realize what he had done apparently when he woke up the next morning. So murder's a lot closer to home than many of us may realize, and many families have been affected in some way or touched by it in some way. There's a couple at my home church, just 10 years ago or so now, who they were murdered by some guy who had committed armed robbery somewhere else in the country and was driving through and picked out their house to rob them, and then he murdered them. I remember going to that funeral, and just a horrible, horrible situation. And when we're talking about this commandment, thou shalt not murder, I say murder intentionally because you're probably used to hearing thou shalt not kill. But when we're talking in this case, we're talking specifically about the taking of innocent life for no good reason at all. Our crime rates, many will tell you our crime rates are much better today than they have been a long, long time. Our crime rates and violent crime rates in our country began to accelerate and to increase after World War II. And in 1960, out of 100,000 people, we had a violent crime rate in general of 160, almost 161. That's 1960. That was a dramatic increase itself from years previous to that. And then by 1991, that rate had gone from 161 basically to over 758. Since then, it has decreased to today, 2016, it was 386.3. That's still 2.5 times more than it was in 1960. So although we have made strides since 1991, we're still 2.5 times the rate of violent crime than we had in 1960. So what has changed? A lot has changed in that time. And it's not just one little thing here, one little thing there. Our culture, our society has changed in many, many, many different ways. And these commandments can't be separated one from another. They're all interrelated in some way. That's why James will tell us that to break one law is to break all of the law, because all of the law really goes together. So when we're thinking about murder and why taking another human life is wrong, in Genesis chapter 9 verse 6 it gives us this. God says there, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. For God made human beings in his own image. God made humans in his image. That's the reason given for why it's wrong to take the life of another human being. In the sense of murder. Now, I know I've got a lot of pacifist friends that would want to say all killing is wrong, and it is. It is all bad and it's all wrong, but it's not all murder. In the case of self-defense, in the case of capital offense and capital punishment, and here we have prescription for capital punishment. But even there, we shouldn't ever take the taking of another human life lightly and frivolously, and certainly not maliciously at all, no matter what the circumstances may be. But we're talking here specifically about the sin of murder. And it's wrong because God created humans in his image. This doesn't say that God created part of humanity in his image. This doesn't say that God created certain races in his image or certain countries in his image. God created all of humanity in his image and after his likeness. And it doesn't tell us here that in terms of individuals that it's just one part of a human being that's in the image of God, but that the human being in her entire being is created in the image of God. We often think of the value of human life in terms of the usefulness of each human life. But that's not the way the Bible looks at the value of human life. That's not the way we should look at the value of human life. Look, we're all created in the image of God, whether you're male or female, whether you are incredibly gifted and abled physically or mentally or intellectually, or you're less so. All of us are created in the image of God. And we do need to think of it in terms of our capacity to express that image, but also realizing that the image of God in us all, because of sin and the fallen world we live in, has been inhibited and distorted in some way. And that includes not only spiritually in our relationship with God, but in our relationship with others, and in our relationship with the earth. And it includes our spiritual capacity, our mental capacity in some form or fashion, and also our physical capacity is affected by the original sin, human sin, what we call original sin, or you can call it general sin. I've used that term. But it affects us all and inhibits us all from fully expressing that capacity that God has given to all of us as individuals and collectively to reflect His image, His righteousness. It's connected, the image of God is connected in Ephesians 4 to His righteousness and His holiness. That's why He created us. So when we begin to think about the sacredness and the value of a human life, we've got to go back and think about God's original design and intent for humanity in general and for each individual in particular. And we've got to think about not only God's original design and intent, but also the purpose, what we might call the telos, if you will, to use a philosophical term. What was God's purpose? And what will be God's purpose? What is God's purpose for us in the new heaven and the new earth where there is no more sin? So we don't want to just think about the human life and the sacredness of the human life and the human being in terms of this fallen world and our ability to express that capacity. God created us not only to love, but He created us to be loved. And as a matter of fact, we first love God. We love as a response to God's love for us. That's first. That takes priority, and that should be the same for each and every human being. However they can express, and I believe there's a lot more going on than people can express. I know I'm inhibited to express the fullness of what God created me for mentally. I'm limited, and I'm becoming more and more, a lot of my people that know me, oh yeah. But I'm just saying that I can tell as I get older, more mature, that I am inhibited in my capacity to express that capacity that God has placed in me. And others are in different ways, and we're all trudging through this life in hope, praise God, in hope of the return of Jesus Christ, when our capacity will be completely renewed and healed to flourish and to be expressed the way God originally intended it. So we've got to think about humanity in those terms, and not just in terms of an individual's ability or usefulness to someone in some capacity in this world. That's a pagan way of looking at the human being, and now not a Christian way of looking at a human being. And the Christian way of looking at a human being has changed the world, no doubt about it. There's an ancient historian, Tom Holland, who he said for a long time he scoffed and ridiculed and was skeptical of Christianity, but the more he learned about ancient history and the basis of the Judeo-Christian worldview that everybody's created in the image of God, he realized just how much good Christianity and the Judeo-Christian worldview, because of this, has brought to the world. The sacredness of human life, the sacredness of each individual in a humanity in general. So that's why murder is striking at that image, and it's not only striking out against another human being and sinning against another human being, it's striking out against the one in whose image we were created. Striking out and lashing out against God. Well, where does murder come from? Where does murder come from? I listened to a gentleman giving a lecture a while back, and someone asked him about murder in the inner cities, for example, and it didn't fit the prevailing political narrative he wanted to tell at the time, and he found it somewhat of a nuisance, obviously, and he dismissed it as a distraction and as in some way could be explained by outside forces, the system, if you will. But Jesus tells us that murder doesn't come from without, outside of us. Murder and every other sin of the human heart comes from within. In Mark chapter 7, verses 21 through 23 there, Jesus said it's from within, from the human heart is corrupted by sin, and the desires that we have that have been tainted by sin that bring about the evil in the world. Evil comes from within the human heart, and it can get codified certainly in systems, and they shouldn't be one pitted against the other, but we can't underestimate the nature of sin in the human heart. James asked the question in James 4, where do the quarrels and fights come from among you? Is it not from your passions that are at war among you, those desires that are set on fire of hell? He doesn't use that language there, but I'm adding that. And he says, you covet and you want, and to get what you want, you murder. You murder to get what you want. So murder is this interaction between all of these desires. And 1 John, the third chapter there just says flat out, look, if you hate your brother, you are a murderer. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that hate and anger towards your brother is dangerous. It's a danger because it's spiritually the equivalent of physical murder, to hate another human being in this world, to hate our neighbor. So there's times where you hear about situations where a murder has taken place, and oftentimes you can see how the sin of adultery, for example, is interweaved into that. I told the story about my wife before we went into ministry full-time in the Methodist church and took a church, and I went to seminary at Duke. My wife was working part-time in a Walmart, and there was two young guys. They were openly and adamantly atheist, and made sure to talk about that quite a bit at work. But anyway, they were really close friends, but we were shocked to find out, and my wife got to know them quite well working with them. We were shocked to find out after we had moved, not long after, that one of the young guys had murdered the other right there in my home community in Pinnacle. And it also, I believe, murdered, pretty sure the story involved the murder of one of the boy's girlfriends. I don't know all that was going on in that situation, but there was probably an interaction with some of these other desires and passions and frustrations and the anger that lies underneath all of that. So when we're thinking about where does murder come from, it comes from the human heart, corrupted by human desires, and it has its roots in generalized anger, and anger that's not checked, an anger gone unchecked. See, there's a difference between righteous anger and wrath, what we would call the deadly sin of wrath. We should be angry at injustices that occur in the world in an acute sense, but not in a chronic sense, not in a sense where that anger continues to just simmer and fester within us, and we're just angry at people all the time, and angry at our enemies, and angry at our those who believe differently from us, or angry at those who look different from us, or whatever the case may be. That anger doesn't and shouldn't carry over into every aspect of our lives and fuel our everyday lives. We should not be fueled by that kind of anger towards our fellow man in any way, shape, or form. Murder arises from that kind of unchecked anger and rage that sees underneath, and it's driven by jealousy and envy and resentment and bitterness and these kinds of things. And we need to be aware that anger is danger. Anger is dangerous. And if we allow ourselves and our society to stew in anger, look, stew's good. I love stew, but when I'm the main ingredient and you're the main ingredient, that ain't good. If we allow hatred and anger to simmer, it's going to end up being a devil's stew, and we're going to be the main ingredients, and that's not a good thing. But there's also a problem not only with anger, but anger is a lot of times driven by suspicion and mistrust and feelings of betrayal and paranoia even. I think there's a lot of paranoia on the radical left and the radical right, and has been in our society for a long time. And that suspicion and that mistrust is not good. It is dangerous. And the worst thing you can do in a situation like that is use lies and misrepresentation as a strategy to fulfill an agenda. I use as an analogy, I heard a clinical psychologist, Jordan Peterson, who's become quite popular today, a professor of psychology at the University of Toronto. He was talking with a group and basically said to this group of students learning to be clinical psychologists, he says, look, if you're dealing with somebody who is paranoid, he said the absolute worst thing you can do is lie in any form, shape, or fashion to that person. If they're already paranoid, he said, you do not want to, lie to them. It would be like adding fuel to the fire, and he yelled at them, it's dangerous. Well, I would say to you today, with everything that we've got going on and the hostilities that are underneath the surface and this resentment and this bitterness and this rancor that we see today, and the accusations that are flying around left and right that we're seeing today, that it is dangerous. I know I know a lot of folks that believe that the ends justify the means, and corrupt means are sometimes necessary, and even deceit and lying and misrepresentation to bring about an agenda. I know there are folks out there that follow that plan. Look, I just listened to a couple weeks ago a lecture from a professor of theology, one of the United Methodist seminaries out in Colorado. Basically, first of all, he was saying that life is meaningless. Life is meaningless, okay? And that all basically we can do is make meaning out of a meaningless situation. Well, that's hard for me to swallow, that all of life is meaningless. He used suffering as the reason, and that's not uncommon, I understand. We even got a lot of well-meaning people saying we don't want to say there's a reason for suffering or there's meaning to it. But I would wonder if we can't say there's meaning to suffering, then we really can't say there's meaning to anything. But this fellow was just saying basically there's no meaning. And the best we can do is just make meaning out of a meaningless situation. He said there's no hope. There's hopelessness is what we have. And but anyway, it wasn't surprising that he would later go on to say in his fight against what he perceives to be injustice, and I'm not sure even how you can calculate that with a philosophy where you don't think anything is meaningful, but that we have to, in our fight against injustice, we have to be willing to corrupt ourselves and to be corrupted. And he was echoing Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals right out of it. I could just be, reading right along from Rules of Radicals with what he was saying. And he was saying that we need to be willing to use corrupt means to bring about our good ends. Well, whatever that means. And he said if we need to lie, we lied. If we need to steal, we steal. Look, that's the word. When you're in a volatile situation with people who are already mistrusting and suspicious and even paranoid, then the worst thing you can do is add lies to the mix. It's a dangerous cocktail, and it will just fuel the fires of the stew of the devil, if you will. So we've got to understand the underlying issue here. John tells us, as I said, Jesus says, hatred makes you a murderer. You may so despise and so hate somebody else that you may have said in your heart at times, I wish they were, and you fill in the blank. That's murder. That murder is not that far from home. Murder is very, very close, closer than we oftentimes imagine. And the danger can be this unchecked anger and resentment. See, the Bible says, don't let the sun go down on your wrath. Do not let this is Ephesians, don't let the sun go down upon your wrath, and do not give place to the devil. Look, if we're letting anger go unfettered and unchecked, and we're not dealing with it on a regular basis in our own hearts and the lives of the people around us and in society, if we're just continuing to add to that underlying hostility, anger, and resentment and rancor, we are participating in the works of the devil that Jesus came to destroy there that 1 John 3 talks about. And we don't want to play that game. We're being played for fools. We're being played for absolute fools. We don't want to simmer in the devil's stew. We've got to stop it. We've got to stop getting angry and hating one another. I can disagree, but that doesn't mean I hate you. You can disagree, but you don't have to hate me. And we don't have to be mad all the time at each other over. I mean, we get mad over any little thing sometimes, and hold grudges and resentment and bitterness over any little thing, and it can get out of hand. There's this story I saw one of the television programs. A true story where a lady had been living beside someone for a long time, and their properties adjoined, and there was a little plot of property where this lady was allowed by her neighbor to plant a flower garden. It was kind of, most of it was on the other person's property, and her neighbor allowed this lady to plant a flower garden there. But this other neighbor eventually either moved away or died or something, and someone else moved in, and they realized that that was actually on their property. And without really knowing, as far as I remember, they began to use that for themselves, to put something on it or whatever the case may be, and the other neighbor wasn't allowed to use it. And then she got upset about it and tried to explain how she'd been using it, but the other person said, well, you know, I don't think so. I think I want to use it myself. So they began a feud between those two neighbors, and one neighbor would try to do things to sabotage the other, and it got out of hand. It escalated. And eventually this woman who had been planting this flower garden on her neighbor's property for a long time, she eventually moved away, but she allowed that continued bitterness and anger and rancor to simmer and to stew in it even after she moved away, and it ate her up to the point where she plotted and planned to go back and blow up her old neighbor's house. But in the process, in setting these pipe bombs that she had figured out how to make in the van that was parked right outside of the neighbor's house, she accidentally detonated those bombs and blew herself to smithereens right there in the drive, on the side of the street, in front of her old house and her neighbor's house. Horrible situation. Unchecked anger is dangerous for us. It's dangerous for our neighbors, and we need not allow it. We should not allow it to go unchecked. There is an antidote to hate. There is an antidote to that kind of unrestrained, unfettered anger. And the only true antidote is love. I know it may sound cliche, but the antidote to hate is love. Hate plus hate equals 2 times the hate. Hate times hate is just much more hate. Hate to the nth degree, the nth power, is just exponentially more hate. But hate responded to in love can change circumstances for the better. Look, Jesus taught us this. I'm not talking about some song the Beatles sang. I'm talking about Jesus here and true love and what true love really is. It's not just a blanket permissiveness and allowing anybody and everybody to just believe and do and think whatever they want to think without saying anything or any of that kind of stuff that people think of today. but it's responding to lies with truth. It's responding to hate with love. It's responding to persecution with prayer. It's responding to cursing with blessing. Jesus taught us this. Listen to this from Luke chapter 6. Here, right before this, you got to listen to, these things are connected. I think sometimes we don't realize the connection here, and we just jump to one passage without realizing the connection to the other. But Jesus says in verse 22 of chapter 6 of Luke, he says, "Blessed are you when people hate you." Now that sounds odd, doesn't it? When they exclude you and revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of the Son of Man. Rejoice in that day and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven, for so their fathers, did to the prophets. Look, the bottom, I just had to pause to make sure that was recording there, sorry. The bottom line is here, this is the deal. There's a lot of times where accusations against the church fly haphazardly. And sometimes the church deserves the blame. But we can never ever forget that the word devil means slanderer. And the word Satan means accuser. And sometimes the accusations that are leveled against the church are false. And they come not from God, they're not prophetic, they're evil. And they come from evil and with malicious intent. That's what Jesus is saying here, that we should rejoice when that happens. That's an odd thing to say, it seems, doesn't it? That we should rejoice when that happens. But look, he later on goes to say and warn those when everybody speaks well of you. Look, the most popular preachers are not always the best preachers. The ones that everybody loves, the Bible here is warning us that you need to be on guard. The ones that, those that people just think are the greatest thing since sliced bread may not be, okay? So we've got to be wise. But Jesus, after talking about being blessed because of those who hate you and slander you and misuse you and revile you and exclude you, we know what that's about. Marginalizing the people of God who stand for what's right. But he says here in verse 27, "But I say to you who hear, love your enemies." Now we've heard this, but what enemies? Specifically, what enemies? Well, the same ones, he said, who will hate you, who will exclude you, who will revile you and spurn your name as evil on account of Jesus. Those are the ones especially that we should respond not with more hate, but with love. With love. Love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. You know, if you read through the Gospels, that in the light and in the path of Jesus' preaching and teaching and his ministry and proclaiming the kingdom of God, that he made a lot of folks upset. He made a lot of folks upset for including certain folks that they wanted to exclude, and for forgiving sins as only God could forgive sins. And especially, he caught a lot of flack for calling out the false prophets and the false teachers in his day. And when they were called out, when they knew that he was telling parables against them, the Bible tells us there in these stories in the Gospels that they became angry. They became enraged. They began to seethe in that anger. That anger began to stew within them. And they plotted. And they began to plot and to plan the murder. The murder of the Son of God. Murder is a lot closer to home than we sometimes realize. They tried to murder the one who was God in the flesh. As someone said, they tried to push God out of this world onto a cross. Murder. They conspired to commit murder. Yet in spite of that, in spite of all of that, Jesus hung there on that cross to which he had been nailed, and he prayed for those who had nailed him to it, and those who had conspired against him to have him murdered. He prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." He responded to their hatred and their reviling from the cross to which they had nailed him with love. Love is the antidote to hate. Love is the cure. Hatred and sin is the disease. Love and righteousness is the cure. And we need to be people not only of love, but also of truth, because lies are the fuel to the fires of the enemy. So our prayer today, as we often pray, should be, Lord, deliver us from evil. And Jesus shows us exactly how God does that. Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. God bless you.